This is an application that I wrote for an educator, and basically it's just an application that's designed to take roll call for students, and that data is then saved in a file on the computer, on the server, that can be used later to look at the students' attendance. So I'm just going to go through the functionality, and then we'll look at the code after that. So we can view our students. As you can see, got the IDs on one side and the names on the other side. And then we can add a student. So if we look at this, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We've got 6 students there. So if we add a student, let's call it test video, and so now you've added a student, and we can check that there's our student is added under over there, test video, and I think that's 7/8, the ID number. And then if you want to delete a student, then we just enter their ID number, and then we'll see that that student is now gone. So that's the basic functionality of seeing who we've got on file, seeing which students we have on file, and then adding or deleting students as you need to. And then the core of the program is taking attendance, so we can do that. We asks for the date, so let's call that the 3rd. And then for this particular institution, they wanted me to use the letters A and H. I'm not sure which is for which, but so I suppose A is for absent. So you can press A or you can press H. If we press a different letter, then it will ask us for the same name again, and we'll go from there. And if you keep pressing different letter, it will just keep asking you until you press A or H. And then we've got the attendance. Maybe we can just look at that. The attendance is over here. So this is obviously, I've done this a few times, but here we can see I've sorted out some bugs here, so I've sorted those out. So here we've taken our attendance, the 3rd, so that's our attendance. So you can see the name and the letter. So this data can be imported to Excel, and then it can be worked with. So that's basically how this program works. So if we look at the code, the main program is just calling this main menu function, which is in the main menu class. So this is the .h file, and in our main menu CPP file, we've basically got an infinite loop, which asks you which function you'd like to execute. And I believe the switch function isn't as widely used today, but I quite like it for situations like this. It's quite simple. So here we've got our different functions depending on which function or what input the user decides to input. Over here, I'm not sure in which header file the go to XY function is, but I sort of wrote this, which does exactly the same thing. It just moves the cursor to a specific point on the command line screen, so that we can actually, instead of having all of this in the corner, and sort of move it to the middle of the screen. Because I'm using my external screen, it's not in the middle, but on my laptop, the output here is actually in the middle of the screen. So the go to XY function basically allows me to move where I output the letters to. So that's the main menu function, just an infinite loop. System CLS that just clears the screen, and we'll see later why that's important. Yeah, so that's the main menu class. And then we've got the student class, which basically just has a bunch of functions that is executed based on what the user inputs. So this is the student CPP file. Got a couple of variables that I need to use across the different functions. That's why they are declared outside of the functions. I've got the count function that basically just tells me how many students are in the file. I need that for various functions. I'll just use the count function, which returns the number of students wherever I need it in the other functions. Set date, that is where I ask for the date when we take attendance. The systemcl is basically, I'll just show you what that does. When I press 2 to take attendance, it basically makes the main menu screen go away. So that just means I'm not going to be working on the same screen and cluttering up the screen every time I go to a new function or a new function on the command line. It will clear the screen, so it's a lot easier to work with. Just get rid of this. So that's the set date. Yeah, just getting the date from the user. This is present function. All this does is puts the students' IDs and the students' names into the vector, into the int vector and the string vector. So the ID vector and the name vector. So that puts all the students that are on file, puts all of their names and IDs into a vector. So this is quite interesting. I quite like this. You can't put it directly into, you can't use getLine on an int. So we get the ID as a string into getLine, and then we turn that variable into an int, and that int variable is stored in the ID variable. So from the string it's turned into an int, and then the int is pushed back into the int vector, if that makes sense. Because we can't push back a string into the int vector, the string is turned into an int and the int is pushed back into the int vector. I'm sure there are other ways to do it. Obviously there's always another way to do it, but that seemed simplest for me. So that's basically what isPresent does. It puts the ID and the name of all the students into my ID and name vector. Output attendance. Basically what this does is, this is basically the function that takes attendance. You'll see when I press 2 and I take attendance, it asks me to set the date. It puts those students' IDs and names into those variables, and then it calls output attendance. And basically what output attendance does is it iterates over the count, which is the number of students on file. It outputs the name of the first student and asks me to tell the computer whether the person is, or whether the student is present or absent. And then it gets that input. If we use the right letter, then it outputs the name and the date, the name of the student, and whether they're present, puts that into the file. If we don't put in the right letter, then it asks us to please enter valid input, and then it goes into another function which I'll get into later. But if we put in the right input, enter the right input, then this counter counts. And the reason I've got this counter is so that if I put in the incorrect input, I can see at what student I last entered the correct input, so that when I call this invalid function, I can enter the place where I last stopped into this function, and that will then tell me where or which student I should ask, which student's attendance I should ask for again. So you will remember that when I input the incorrect letter into the command line, it asks me for the same name again. So basically, this counter counts where I last stopped, and it tells me, okay, you need to start at the specific student where you last stopped. So that's basically why that this counter is there. So the invalid function is pretty much the same as output attendance. It basically just tells me where to start and how many students are left in the file, and then it does the same thing as output attendance function. And if I put in the incorrect input, then it just calls itself again. So this will happen continuously until we reach the last student. This static is quite important, and I was struggling with this for a while. I kept getting an error, or what was happening was, if I input the incorrect input a few times, then I would start to turn into weird numbers. Once I reached the last number, so once I was smaller, or once I was no longer smaller than iterator, basically I just changed its value to a small number again, and it kept going, and I wasn't sure why. And then I did some research, and I figured out that if you add the static word over there, then basically I is initialized once, so it won't keep reinitializing when this for loop is when the for loop goes around, basically. So that solved that problem. So that's basically what happens when we take attendance. Next is to add a student. Yeah, we've got the system CLS again, which just clears the screen when we do that. Got a couple of variables that are needed. cin ignore is important because when you use cin, the value is still in the buffer, so that when you use getLine, it interferes with how getLine receives the values, basically. So cin ignore just clears the buffer so that when you use getLine, everything's fine. So when we add a student, asks us for the name, we get the name, asks for the ID, and we get the ID, and then opens the students file. The iOS app is important because that just puts the cursor in the file basically starts at the end of the file, so that it appends whatever data to the end of the file. The app stands for append. So any data you write into the file will be written to the end of the file. So it continues writing to the end of the file. And the ID and the name is added to the end of the file. That's all that happens with the add student. Delete student, again system CLS. We open our students file, and then we also open a temporary file, which is in this case temp.txt, and then we ask for the ID of the student that needs to be deleted. And then basically what happens is that over the number of students, we've got a for loop over the number of students here, we look at the ID, and if the ID is not the same as the ID we want, if the ID is not the same as the ID of the student that we want to delete, then we write that over to the temp file. However, if it is the same, then we don't output it, which means that basically we're writing everyone over to another file except the person that we want to delete. And in essence, we're deleting that person because we're not adding them to the temporary file. Once we've done that, we can remove the old students file that still includes the student we want to delete, and then all we do is we rename our temporary file to students. So it's essentially like having the original file, but it just doesn't include the person that we want to delete. So in that sense, we've sort of gotten rid of the person that we wanted to delete, and so we've deleted them. So that's the delete function. And then just to view the students is quite simple. Again, system CLS, open the students file. Uh, this is the headers for the output, ID and name separated by a couple of tabs. And then we get the ID and the name from the student file, and we output the ID and the name from the student file onto the command line screen. And then we basically pause so that we can see all the names, and then we close the file. So that's basically how the view students work. It's not a lot of functionality, but it's essentially what was needed in this case. I'm most likely going to add a couple of things, such as when the student is deleted successfully, just have something pop up on the screen that says student deleted successfully, or if something goes wrong, just have the screen say error, something like that, just so that the user can be confident that whatever they're doing is working. So that's my roll call application.